Evolutionary Theory and Psychology, Charles Darwin, Part 2. Professor Michael Botwin, Department of Psychology, California State University, Fresno. In our last video, we discussed how Darwin made his original scientific statements about barnacles. Darwin continued to study many things, including barnacles. His son once asked a friend of his, "Where does your dad keep his barnacles at?" So he continued raising his children. He loved his kids and his family dearly. He lost one of his children early on. He had continual health problems, but he endured on working on developing his theory of evolution. One day, a small envelope comes to him from the Malay Archipelago, which is in the South Pacific, written by someone he'd corresponded with before, Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace, it turns out, independently comes up with the theory of natural selection. There becomes a major dilemma. So before we talk about this dilemma as to who gets the claim to fame for natural selection, let's talk about Alfred Russel Wallace a bit. Now, Alfred Russel Wallace was a very different person than Charles Darwin. To start with, he was not a member of the elite British aristocracy. His father was a businessman who really didn't do very well in business. Wallace had to pretty much support his way through life himself. He shared Darwin's deep interest in natural history, which is what it was called at the time, and he decided that he would earn a living, since he had to earn a living, unlike Darwin, by collecting exotic species in a couple of places, the Amazon River Basin and the Malay Archipelago. So Wallace and a friend and collaborator moved down first to the Amazon Basin. They collected a great many samples of extremely rare and unusual insects. Well, rare and unusual for Great Britain. He would capture these big bugs, mount them, which means to put them on a board, and then they would be framed, not by him, but by one of his helpers down the line. And then they would be sold to wealthy Englishmen who didn't have to go to the Amazon to get these weird-looking, strange, gargantuan bugs. Along the way, what Wallace noticed was that there were subtle variations within members of what seemed like the same species, dependent on their environment. He especially noticed this with beetles, which is ironic because that's one of Darwin's favorite insects. And he noticed in one area the beetles were carnivore, omnivore in another, vegetarian in still another. They developed specializations for living either in rocks on the side of the river or in the forest or in other areas. But he noticed they all seemed to have the root in the same species of beetle. And so he posited that adaptation to the environment was the mechanism required for evolutionary change. He was very pragmatic. He didn't sit around for 20 years thinking about it like Darwin had. Wrote up his ideas that ended up being a 6-page abstract of his theory. He sent it to Darwin. He sent it to a couple of other people. As you would imagine, this caused quite a stir in Darwin's circle of friends. Lyell and some of Darwin's friends got together and decided that both Wallace's 6-page abstract and a short version of Darwin's theory of evolution be read into the minutes of something called the Linnaean Society in 1858. Neither man was present. In fact, Wallace was sick with malaria in the Malay Archipelago and wasn't even notified that they were going to present his paper. He found out many weeks after. In science, there's something called priority. Who gets there first gets the credit. Well, Darwin's friends and buddies naturally had Darwin's paper read first. Oh, Darwin was ill and he couldn't make the trip to London from his house. So actually, the recording secretary of the Linnaean Society, when he was summing up the papers presented into the minutes of the Linnaean Society for that year, remarked that there were no remarkable scientific discoveries. So why isn't this the Darwin-Wallace theory of evolution? Some people believe it should be. Wallace came back to England, spent a lot of time writing about evolution. He did get his credit for coming up with the idea independently of Darwin. He agreed with Darwin on some things. Most notably, he disagreed with Darwin on the notion of sexual selection. What happened eventually with Wallace was it was kind of a English class issue. Wallace, not coming from money, kind of had to keep on moving on, making a living for himself. He also fell into becoming an early socialist Marxist. As you can imagine, Marxist, socialist, communism, not too highly favored by the British upper class. He kind of did himself in by starting to believe in seances, attending seances, getting involved in paranormal activities, and lost all of his scientific credibility. Well, let's finish with some more basic issues in evolutionary theory. Darwin says in any generation, not all individuals of the same species succeed in reproducing. Some individuals produce many offspring, some very few. And members of any species are not identical. They exhibit variation. Variation is the key to evolution. If everybody's the same, there's nothing to change to. From this variation, there are also environmental differences. Those individuals that are more adapted to the environment most likely are going to leave more offspring, with the majority of their variations inherited in the next generation and transmitted from parent to offspring over many generations. So Darwin says reproductive success is not random. It's associated with inherited characteristics, some of which could be more beneficial than others in particular circumstances. And you find this in the evolutionary history of many animals. Some adaptations more successful than others. Those more successful adaptations are passed on to succeeding generations. Here's Darwin's Tree of Life. I've just copied the wording there. That's one of the initial versions of it from his diaries. He kept many notebooks and diaries of his work. Here's a modern version of the Tree of Life. A little bit more complicated. Darwin also says evolutionary theory is based on the struggle of survival. And it's two things, survival and reproduction. But it's just not survival, period. It's survival to a period of time where the organism can indeed reproduce. But what Darwin notes is that selection occurs at the level of the individual. We all make our own choices, consciously or unconsciously, mostly unconscious, as to what we're doing in terms of the evolution game. How many children are we going to have? How much am I going to invest in these children? Some people choose to have 1 or 2 kids. Other people may have 8 or 10 kids. It's an individual choice, especially now with modern methods of birth control. We decide what environments to live in, what places where our families can best thrive. So selection, and I can't impart this enough to you, occurs at the level of the individual. Now there are some individuals that to this day try to talk about group selection. Group selection really doesn't ever work very well. The only place it may work are in animals that have specialized social orders, for example bees, where only the queen reproduces. Group selection basically doesn't work. We make our choices at the evolution game individually. We decide whether we're going to be successful or not. And again, this is conscious or unconscious. Another major point to make is that evolution is non-directional. This again gets at that point that we made about good old Herbert Spencer. Evolution is simply change. If the environment changes, then the best adaptations may change as well. We're going to talk about it very briefly here, but we will talk about it in great detail in other video lectures. Darwin lays out two forms of selection. Natural selection, which is adapting to the environment, but he also noticed that there are some characteristics that don't seem to be adaptive to the environment, but they're adaptive for reproductive success because the opposite sex is very attracted. And Darwin called this sexual selection. We'll talk about this at a later point in our video. I want to close our biography of Darwin, and it's been kind of a jumping around, skipping around biography because it's for limited purposes here, with a couple of quotes at the time. Samuel Wilberforce says, "If then, said I, the question is put to me, would I have a miserable ape for a grandfather, or a man highly endowed by nature and possessed by great means and influence, and yet who employs these faculties and that influence for the purpose of introducing ridicule into grave scientific discussions? I unhesitantly affirm my preference for the ape." And I agree with Wilberforce on that one. This shows you the times. Remember, these were Victorian era times. The woman here isn't even identified by name. She's identified as being the wife of the Bishop of Worcester, who commented on the origin of the species. "Descended from apes, my dear, let us hope that it is not true, but if it is, let us pray that it will not become generally known." Darwin had several major works. His first work only had a couple of pages about humans, The Origin of Species. He didn't really get into a discussion of the evolution of the human until The Descent of Man in 1871, where he also lays out his ideas of sexual selection. This was followed in 1872 by the expression of emotion in man and animals, where Darwin showed that emotional stimuli are the same emotional stimuli across species. And there are some universal notions to how we express emotions. And he comes up with several laws for that. You've got the Darwin basics. Now we're going to start working on filling in the pieces in the succeeding lectures in this series. See you next time. This has been a We Have Couches video production. Copyright 2020, Professor Michael Botwin. All rights reserved.